So, recently Nintendo announced a Majora's Mask remake for the 3DS. While everybody and their dog knew it was going to happen eventually, I personally still got really excited, and it kind of inspired me to launch a web series I've been thinking about for a long time now. It's called Hyrule's History Book, and its main focus is going to be on Hyrule and its many neighboring countries, as well as their inhabitants, wildlife, and pretty much anything else lore related. In honor of Majora's Mask making its way to 3DS, my first episode will be on Skull Kids. The Skull Kids are as tragic as they are interesting. They've played the role of both enemy and ally, and although they have only appeared in a few games, they have managed to really define themselves as one of the more odd and interesting races in Hyrule. While they seem to have really only survived in the child timeline, that still hasn't stopped fans like me from doing a ton of research on them. While the Skull Kids do vary in appearance from game to game, there are a few things that do remain consistent throughout the series. They're always about the size of a child, and they can always be seen wearing old, tattered clothes, with a predominant color scheme of orange and brown, and you can always see them wearing large, brown, wide-brimmed hats. Quite often, you can also find the Skull Kids with a musical instrument. Usually it's a flute, but it has been known to be different. The Skull Kids seen in Ocarina of Time can canonically be considered the first known appearances of the Skull Kids, and thus they are the defining model the rest of the series follows. So, Nintendo has gotten themselves in trouble a few times now with the highly controversial blackface. Considered by some to be incredibly racist, they have used the blackface for Jinx the Pokemon, as well as Wario Land 3 enemy Octo, and this practice continued with the Skull Kids, who had a pitch black face and giant puffy orange lips. Many people drew comparisons between the Skull Kids and the portrayal of black characters in the media of the late 19th century, otherwise known as gollywogs, which found itself popularized in the form of dolls sold to children. While the similarities to characters like Jinx or Mr. Popo from Dragon Ball Z to the gollywogs are absolutely undeniable, I personally don't think that was quite what Nintendo was going for with the Skull Kids. Regardless, Nintendo did notice that people were being offended by this, and so starting with Majora's Mask, continuing into Ocarina of Time 3DS, the Skull Kids were changed to have a woody texture on their skin as opposed to pure black. And I do imagine we can see this change continued into the Majora's Mask remake. The singular Skull Kid in Majora's Mask looks fundamentally similar, but his character model has a fair amount of extra detail added. The browns and oranges were changed to be a bit more red and yellow, and the clothing overall is just a bit more neat and tidy as opposed to the very baggy clothing worn by the other Skull Kids. And although he spends the majority of the time wearing Majora and concealing his face, it is worth noting that the controversial orange lips were replaced with a small beak, which in my opinion suits the Skull Kid more anyhow. So, fast forward hundreds of years into the future to Twilight Princess, and the Skull Kids look radically different. They're still about the size of a child, and still dressed in clothing obviously inspired by the forest they live in, but that's about where the similarities end. His clothing is much more simplified, with a very large baggy potato sack sweater that's much too big, and a hat almost the same size as him. The flute that could be seen with his ancestors has developed into a trumpet-like instrument, and he can also be seen carrying a lantern around everywhere he goes. But by far the most notable and dramatic difference is his skin color. Over the hundreds of years between Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess, his skin has changed completely, going from pitch black to very bright bluish gray, and his beak has slowly given way for a large toothy grin. I wouldn't really know what to attribute this to, but his large pointy Hylian-like ears give away that somewhere along the line there may have been some crossbreeding between Skull Kids and Hylians, which would explain how the skin color can change so quickly. So, we've cemented the fact that Skull Kids do vary in appearance, but there is one thing that rings true regardless of how many hundreds of years have passed. The Skull Kids are forever found deep inside massive forests, like the Lost Woods or the Faron Woods. Some say this is because travelers are likely to be lost and at their mercy, but I think it's far more likely that it's simply a byproduct of their evolution, as we'll discuss a little bit later on. Skull Kids are essentially children, and thus they live their entire existence as one big game. They're very mischievous, and they seek nothing more than a good prank and some enjoyable companionship. They're very quick to befriend strangers, as seen with the various Skull Kids' immediate acceptance of Link and the Kokiri in general. Indeed, Skull Kids can be very kind and enjoy giving small gifts to their friends. At times, they truly do embody the loving spirit of a small child. However, having the heart of a child comes at the cost of having the emotions and naivety of a child as well. Skull Kids have been shown to wear their emotions on their sleeves, so to speak, and it's been shown numerous times that Skull Kids have a very bad temper and are very quick to anger. When they are upset, they tend to throw nasty, violent tantrums that may harm those around them. Much like a child, Skull Kids are overly capable of being downright mean and nasty and very selfish. Deep down though, Skull Kids are just as lonely and vulnerable as any other child, and this is really shown in Majora's Mask, with how poorly Skull Kid deals with the supposed rejection of the four giants. However, the bright side of it all is that they are certainly capable of learning right from wrong, also showcased at the end of Majora's Mask. This is likely a byproduct of their age, as it is very hard for one to live for hundreds of years and not gain at least a little bit of perspective on things. There is a very likely chance the initial Skull Kids were a product of Kokiri, who wandered far enough into the forest to no longer be under the watchful eye and protection of the Deku Tree's magic. There are multiple lines of dialogue in-game supporting this fact, and assuming it is true, it would mean they are very closely related to Stalfos, cousins even. Assuming it's true that Skull Kids were formerly Kokiri at one point, it would mean they are likely immortal. This is further supported in the story told to Link by Anju's grandmother, where you are told the Skull Kid has been the friend of the giants for about a century. This immunity to age would naturally lead to them being defensive over time, as much like lobsters in real life. The odds of them meeting death at the hand of something fatal is ever present. This fact is likely what leads to them being so initially mistrusting of adults, and why they simply attack them on sight. As we discussed earlier, the first known canonical appearance of a Skull Kid is in Ocarina of Time, deep within the Lost Woods. They can be found scattered about the forest, but the likeliest first encounter will be with a lone Skull Kid dancing atop a tree trunk, playing Sarah's song on his flute. This makes sense, as Sarah is naturally a loving person, and it's not uncommon for Skull Kids to interact with the Kokiri. He wishes to befriend Link as well, and gives him a small gift. The second and third Skull Kids found in Ocarina of Time are even deeper in the woods, and can be found playing music together. If Link approaches them, they're very eager to allow him to play along, and if he manages to keep up, they also offer him gifts of friendship. However, that is not the only interaction the hero of time would have with Skull Kids. The playful race of forest imps would return in his life in a big way. Skull Kids, or the Skull Kid rather, have a major focus in Majora's Mask, as the main antagonist is actually a Skull Kid who simply goes by the name Skull Kid. I won't be going too in depth on him, as I actually do have an entire video about him in the works. The story of Skull Kid is a pretty sad one. He was very close friends with the four giants of Termania for a very long time, and they grew very fond of him as well. However, there came a point where the four giants had decided it was time for them to conserve their strength and lay dormant until they were needed. They each took 100 steps away from the center of Clocktown, towards the four different corners of Termania, and lay dormant. The Skull Kid naively misinterpreted this as them abandoning him, and he became very hurt, very afraid, and above all else, very lonely. The Skull Kid is now by himself in Termania, with nothing to keep him company but his thoughts, and that terrible sadness slowly changed into a sense of betrayal, which itself festered into anger. The anger brooded into hate. The hate caused his childlike sense of wonder to turn into a much more adult sense of vengeance. It turned his natural, mischievous, and carefree nature to something full of malice and despair. However, one dark and stormy night, he meets two fairies named Tattle and Tail, and the three of them become very close friends. For a while, things were okay, but in the back of his mind, he was trying to replace the giants instead of letting them go, and it just wasn't the same. This ongoing inner turmoil attracted the attention of the evil power Majora, who lay dormant in the possession of the Happy Mask salesman. Whether it was willed by Majora, or just bad luck, we may never know. But in the end, Majora ended up in Skull Kid's hands. By this point, Skull Kid had robbed both the Happy Mask salesman and Link, stealing both their prized possessions, Majora and Link's ocarina. At this point in time, Skull Kid is completely filled with hate, and this allows Majora to fill every crevice of Skull Kid's mind, amplifying the instability of his emotions until they snap, allowing Majora complete control. In his rage, and with the power of Majora at his disposal, Skull Kid causes a great deal of damage around Termania, and sends the moon on a crash course into Clocktown. After a long and hard quest, the Hero of Time manages to summon all 4 giants, who grab onto the moon and temporarily save Termania from destruction. However, the sudden appearance of the 4 giants shocks Skull Kid, and he doesn't have the strength or conviction to fight his old friends. After all, in his heart, he is merely a child. This disgusts Majora, who tosses Skull Kid aside like a dirty rag and flies off to the moon, where the evil Mask and Link do battle for the final time. The Hero of Time defeats Majora, and Termania is finally safe. However, as a last request before fading off again, the giants ask Tattle and Tail, as well as Link, to forgive their small friend. Skull Kid catches on to this, and comes to the realization that the giants still cherish his friendship, despite not being with him, and that he had 2 amazing friends available to him all along, as well as Link, who was happy to forgive Skull Kid, despite all the harm he caused. The point of this is to show that even though the Skull Kid is a child at heart, he's still capable of learning right from wrong, even in the most extreme of cases. Hundreds of years in the future, the Hero of Time's descendant would have a run-in with a Skull Kid as well. In Twilight Princess, while inside Faron's woods, Link and Midna become hopelessly lost. However, when all seems for naught, a Skull Kid appears, and leads Link to his destination. Along the way though, he chooses to play a very sick, sadistic version of hide and seek. Every once in a while, the Skull Kid will hide, and summon a few very lethal wooden puppets, which attack Link. Once Link defeats the puppets, the Skull Kid returns, and continues leading Link along the path, using the light of his lantern and the sound of his horn. Strangely enough, this Skull Kid is playing Sarah's song, leading one to believe that either this Skull Kid is the same Skull Kid as Ocarina of Time, or the more likely scenario that the song became very popular among the Skull Kid race, almost becoming an anthem of sorts. After a while, the Skull Kid appears to have tricked Link and led him into a dead end. He summons multiple waves of puppets, and jumps just out of reach. However, Link is able to dispatch the puppets and take a few shots at the Skull Kid with his bow. This is actually enough to please the Skull Kid, who seems honestly delighted with this scenario. He thanks Link earnestly for the fun before rewarding him with the secret entrance, much like the Skull Kid's ancestors rewarded the Hero of Time's friendship. Much later in the game, Link and Midna must once again return to the Sacred Grove, and they are once again aided by the Skull Kid, although are once again forced to play the Skull Kid's version of hide and seek. This time, however, the entrance is already open, and the Skull Kid merely thanks Link and asks him to come back and play again sometime. Yet on future visits, the Skull Kid does not appear, other than the occasional flicker of a lantern from a Skull Kid who's still determined to always help his new friend find his way through the dangerous forest. As an aside, the Skull Kid also appears in Super Smash Bros. Brawl as a sticker that can be applied to Ganondorf, and in Smash Bros. 3DS, as well as the Wii U version, as an assist trophy. The Legend of Zelda fandom is one of the most active fandoms I know, and if something exists, you can be guaranteed there's at least 47 theories behind it. The Skull Kid race, as well as the character Skull Kid, are absolutely no different. And here are some of the most interesting theories I've found. So the first theory suggests that the Twilight Princess generation of the Skull Kid shares rather eerie similarities with the Impo enemy. Both are very small, both are very mischievous in nature, although one is clearly more violent than the other, and aside from their appearances, both carry nearly the exact same lantern. It's also worth noting that in both Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, Skull Kids are often referred to as imps. This is likely just a shot at their size, but it is interesting nonetheless. It is widely believed that an Impo is the result of a Skull Kid's spirit being transformed after dying, but I personally invest in the idea that it's the result of an individual Skull Kid who's unable to hold on to their sanity in the forest, and as they lose the last grips of humanity they have, they simply become mindless killing machines. Others yet believe that after the death of the Great Deku Tree, all Skull Kids became evil, slowly transforming into the Impos over years, and that the Skull Kid in the Sacred Grove was a very singular exception. Probably the most popular theory surrounding the Skull Kids is the idea that the Skull Kid from Majora's Mask is also the Skull Kid who you meet in Ocarina of Time, the one who gives you a heart piece for playing Sarah's song, to be more specific. The major bit of proof offered is the little bit at the end of Majora's Mask. After defeating Majora and clearing the Skull Kid's mind, he mentions to Link that he smells the same as that fairy boy who taught me that song in the woods. The second bit of proof is also at the end of the game. After the credits roll, the screen will settle on a still of the picture Skull Kid carved into the log, and after a bit of time passes, a minimalist version of Sarah's song plays in the background. The only awkward part of the consistency of this theory is that in Ocarina of Time, the Skull Kid immediately recognizes the song by name, suggesting that it was taught to him not by Link, but by Sarah. And while this is just a small bit of conjecture, it is interesting indeed that the Skull Kid in question from Ocarina of Time also has a fixation on masks, wanting a certain mask he sees Link wearing from the Happy Mask shop. And the last theory, which is the most interesting to me personally, is whether or not the Skull Kid truly are Kokiri, and if not, how they're able to individually survive for so long. As mentioned earlier, in Majora's Mask, Anju's grandmother tells a story about the Skull Kid, and how he had been friends with the four giants long before they had entered their sleep. Long enough at least to develop a very deep and profound friendship. And this would be an exceedingly long time before the events of the game began. If this is indeed true, it is not out of the question whatsoever that they may be immortal just like the Kokiri. And if they indeed are immortal, it would make perfect sense that this attribute was something acquired as something from their life as a Kokiri, who are also immortal. Simply getting lost is not likely to erase that from their genes. It's also speculated by a smaller group of people that the Skull Kid found in Twilight Princess is also the Skull Kid from Majora's Mask in Ocarina of Time, due to his knowledge of Sarah's song, and how he seemingly recognizes the Hero of Time's descendant immediately. While the recognition is a valid argument, I do stick to my guns when it comes to Sarah's song, choosing to believe it's more likely become a folk song within Skull Kid society. As a race, the Skull Kids are as fascinating as they are mysterious, and as a character, Skull Kid is tragic, very deep, and ultimately very touching. While the race as a whole seems to have survived to some extent in the child timeline, they as of yet have not appeared in either of the other two timelines. They were likely wiped out in the adult era, and while they have not appeared in the decline timeline, this could very well simply be because the timeline consists of mostly older games. And seeing as the Lost Woods is mostly untouched, I think it's very reasonable to think they may still be lurking in the woods, playing tricks on each other and harassing travelers with their antics. Regardless of which timeline they did and didn't survive in, I think I can safely speak for all of us when I say that we hope to see those little troublemakers again someday.